So, hi everyone. It looks like we're live, and it's been a great day so far at Rise of Privacy Tech. I wanted to introduce this session, which is going to be on privacy challenges and opportunities in Web 3.0 and the Metaverse. I think, as we're all aware, the Metaverse and Web 3 are a super hot topic at the moment, and I'm really delighted to have two experts in this with me, Shiv Malik from Pool Foundation and Rhian Lewis from Boson. Both, and as we were just talking just before, I feel, my name is Gilbert Hill, and I feel very humbled to be in their presence, not least because I'm the only one here who hasn't written a Amazon available book. So that's on my to-do list, as well as to hopefully introduce you all to some of the key concepts in Web3 and the Metaverse, and think about how this impacts on our role and also on the world of privacy tech. So what I wanted to do first is let the panel introduce themselves. I'll start with Rhian.
Hi, so as Gilbert said, I'm Rhian Lewis. I'm developer relations advocate for Boson Protocol. We're a decentralized commerce protocol, which, among other things, enables physical goods and services to be sold as NFTs in the Metaverse. And you can find Boson Portal in Decentraland. More information at bosonportal.io. I'm a software engineer and an author with a specific interest in Web3 and the Metaverse. And as Gilbert kindly mentioned, my book, The Cryptocurrency Revolution, was published just over a year ago. I'm delighted to be here.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rhian. And Shiv, over to you.
Hey, and Gilbert, don't put yourself down. I hear you're still working on your novella, so it's yet to come, is it not?
A difficult second album, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm Shiv Malik. I'm the co-founder of Pool and Pool Data Limited. So I'm an author, as Gilbert has said, a broadcaster, former investigative journalist. So I had a weird, interesting journey to get into tech in that sense. Co-founder of a think tank and a few other things in between. I joined the Web3 space in late 2016, early 2017. Worked for a project called Golem, and then subsequently for Streamer. And at Pool, what we're doing is building infrastructure for these organizations called data unions, sometimes also known as data cooperatives or data trusts, data intermediaries. But they will do the same thing, which is an attempt to aggregate people's data together and then monetize that and sell that and then share the proceeds back with all the members of that union. And Pool delivers the infrastructure for all those organizations.
Brilliant, thanks. Thanks, Shiv. And my name is Gilbert Hill. I'm a privacy technologist and an entrepreneur. I founded one of the first privacy tech companies focused on cookie compliance back in the day, which is now part of the OneTrust suite. I then went on to provide consultancy around GDPR, and I've been always very interested in the consumer side of privacy tech, and I was CEO of a blockchain startup for a couple of years, which built tools for people to exercise their GDPR rights to start to request and repatriate their data, which is where I got introduced to some of the terms that we're going to be discussing in this session, including things like data wallets. Over the past year, I've been providing increasingly providing consultancy to projects in the blockchain space around how to keep on the right side of the regulations, and more importantly, how to start to embed privacy by design into what they're doing. And that's been a really interesting and a really rewarding process to see those projects grow. So now the introductions are over, let's get into introducing some of the building blocks of the Metaverse and Web3. Now, we were joking before this, but Shiv said he knows what I'm like. He said, "Are you going to spend like 30 minutes doing a kind of magnum opus on this?" It's not. It's going to be more of a kind of a whistle-stop tour. But for the audience, please, at any point, if you've got questions or you want clarification or anything, jump in, put something in the comments, and we can respond to it as we talk. There's also going to be time for some questions that we've already had sent to us, and for your questions most importantly. So let's start with Web3. I know both Web3 and the Metaverse have been called lots of things, and I think it's fair to say they're not still not accurately defined. But let's take a really sort of cheesy term and say they're the internet of the future. Now, what do I mean by that? I think putting into context, if we think about Web3 in the context of the development of the web, it is the hype notwithstanding, it's a really, really major shift in how we use the internet. So if you think about Web 1.0, as defined by Tim Berners-Lee, that was kind of a version of the internet that existed, in the 90s and going up into the early noughties. So it was a place where you could, you'd go to get information, and there was a limited number of people creating content. So most of us were going to a site, reading stuff on it, and consuming it. Now, Web 2.0 has come to define the version of the internet that followed, which we're still in largely now. Now, that's one that's dominated by user-created content. Now, this is where the platforms that we all know and interact with, like social media, YouTube, and others came up and grew to this sort of huge size, and also to be critical risk points in terms of the data that they hold, and where we've been more active in terms of leaving comments and cat videos and arguing with everyone on the internet. So, and I think it's important to stress that Web3 isn't, this idea has been knocking around for some time, and one of its biggest proponents has been Gavin Wood, who's co-creator of the Ethereum blockchain. And blockchain technology is a central term, and it's one that I think is better understood than it was. But the core idea of blockchain technology is that data is decentralized. So instead of being stored on central servers owned by one entity, an entire network of computers owned by different individuals, each has a copy of the information. And when we look at this in the context of money, like cryptocurrency, it's a difference between a bank keeping track of your account activity on its own server and a whole network of computers keeping track of it on a shared ledger. And financial transactions are just one application for blockchain networks. And there's if Web3 plays out the way it looks like the blockchain is going to serve as the backbone of Web3 in the future internet. We're also seeing other elements of Web3 emerge too, based on that. So decentralized social networks, search engines, and other apps that use blockchains to let us control that data. And I think that's where all the excitement is, because this is nothing less than the opportunity for techies like ourselves, and for venture capitalists, for investors, to retool all the things on the internet that we currently do around decentralized tech. So that's a little bit about Web3. On the Metaverse side, if you think about Web3, it's about mainly who's owning, controlling the kind of plumbing of the internet. The Metaverse is focused on how users experience the internet of the future. Currently most of us are navigating websites and apps through the screens of computers or smartphones or tablets. Now, Metaverse fans say that we're all going to use virtual reality, VR headsets to enter an immersive world and move between that in the form of digital avatars. Now, each of these virtual worlds is a metaverse, and there are already several online. Things like Sandbox, Fortnite, Decentraland, and we're here doing this via a video conferencing service. In the future, you could put on a VR headset and engage with those avatars in a virtual space. The other last thing to cover is obviously NFTs. Those have exploded, and I think there are a way that the Web3 and the Metaverse start to connect. You know, a digital artist could create an outfit for an avatar to wear in the Metaverse, and then make money by auctioning it along, along with an NFT. And that's where we start to look at, ownership of elements of the Metaverse. And I actually think that's also where the ownership is where the tension comes in, and where privacy can come a cropper. And actually, Twitter founder Jack Dorsey, who's a big Web3, big Bitcoin advocate, he's actually argued that a more decentralized internet isn't necessarily going to increase users' power the way that a lot of people have predicted. He just thinks that it's going to take that power away from big tech and put it in the hands of venture capitalists investing in blockchain apps. Now, I think the jury's out on that, but I think there is a very much a risk with Web3 that there will be another centralized entity with a different label. So that's it. That's a whistle-stop tour around what Web3 is and how you can experience it. So, first question is, do you think is there any glaring omissions in that? What do you think I missed out, Shiv and Rhian, or can we move on to the main questions?
I think just one interesting thing, just from my own experiences in and around Web3, is that the synergies between Web 1 and Web 3 are really evident. Like at a number of conferences I've been to, people from Web 1, the heroes of Web 1, if you want, people who sort of, started Mozilla, etc., like, deliberately invited in, so we can learn their mistakes and learn their ethos from them, sort of sit at their feet. I remember DevCon 4, which is like an Ethereum conference back in Prague a couple of years ago. There are a whole series of conferences aimed just at that in the Bay Area a couple of years ago as well. So there is a lot of synergy because they do hold the same ethos, and they both have a common enemy, if you want, which is basically everything that happened in Web 2. And the one learning that was out of that was that, look, there are new tools to not just, we understand social sharing and how that has massively taken off, and that's been the USP of Web 2. But what we haven't been able to do is capture the value back and retain it within the community, right? So it's easy to, because there is no inherent value mechanism built into the internet until basically now, and blockchain is a tool in which you can do that. So the hope being, okay, great, so we can retain a community to retain its value and not have it captured by outside parties. And I think that would be the only other thing I'd add in there.
Yeah. Sorry, and I'd completely endorse that. It's an element of privacy, but even just on its own, thinking about the value capture that happened during Web 2 that wasn't really an issue with Web 1. And then the monolithic companies came along, and this kind of value capture happens. And now we hope with Web 3, we're moving towards a world where users actually own the value of their data. So it's not strictly privacy, but it's important in the context of everything we're talking about.
I mean, just one other thing, there was literally another version of the internet with competing at the same time as Tim Berners-Lee with a sort of slightly different protocol. Or it may have been using the same HTTP protocol, but it was a conglomerate of kind of Microsoft and Disney, and they were all going to come in and they were going to own the internet because that's what big companies do. Like that was in their ethos, and that's just, that's how they operate. And it didn't work, and they couldn't figure out how to get in, and they couldn't work together because obviously that's where they often fail, is they can't. Often these massive companies can't then sit around a table and figure out and how to carve things up mutually until they did, right? And sort of that's what happened with Web 2.0. Sorry. That's more of the equity angle, obviously, and the kind of economic side of things.
No, I think that's a really excellent point, and I think that's something that was very evident with Web3, that there were these very strong communities which seem to be grassroots. I mean, you talked about, Rhian, I know that you've been very active in a lot of the sort of communities in Berlin and places like that, which sprang up, which did seem to be a counterbalance to a lot of at the time, the very corporate conferences that I was attending, and some of the actual, the direction of travel of some of the privacy tech, which was very much embracing a kind of GRC model around, entities, companies controlling and keep getting their arms around the data that they had, and then meeting their compliance obligations. I'm just wondering that now we're moving, those communities are moving from people getting together in warehouses and being effortlessly cool, and to the metaverse. Is privacy going to get left behind? How do we stop this gamification of a lot of the web being game over for privacy?
Well, I think first let's think about why it's so crucially important with the metaverse. And I know a lot of people are very skeptical about the metaverse because they might have watched the Mark Zuckerberg presentation and thought, that's not me. Why would I want to do this? But all the metaverse is, and it's a journey, because lots of people say with the metaverse, like with Web3, it's where the internet was in the 90s. We're seeing the very beginnings of it, and maybe at the beginning it's not going to be virtual reality, it's going to be mixed reality, or even just immersive experiences that you experience via a screen, like Decentraland and Fortnite at the moment. So in terms of that, maybe we're not going to dive straight in. But the important thing is that I do believe that we are going to be spending more and more and more time in the metaverse in the future. And in real life, we have some degree of privacy in the physical world. Sometimes it might not feel like it when we're walking down the street, and especially in Britain, we have a lot of CCTV cameras. But essentially, you can walk down the street and you can, if not exactly drop off the grid, there are places where you feel like you're not observed and where somebody doesn't know anything about you. And obviously, with the advent of things like animated billboards that respond to your phone and your presence and so on, we're slipping into a version of the world where your commercial preferences are not private anymore. But in the real world, it's only marginal at the moment, and it's optional. You can choose not to carry a phone with you. However, think about when you're on Amazon, for example, and you see particular goods and services marketed to you. And Amazon does that weird thing that if you buy a kettle one week, it then offers you more kettles next week. It's sort of this thing with commerce data, which is quite strange anyway. But you're being marketed particular products and particular goods all the time. Those might not be what you need. And they might also be creating suboptimal markets because they might be rewarding sellers who are not the best people to buy from, or who are there because they favor a particular distribution system that is favored by the platform that you're on, and so on. So in terms of data privacy, it's not even solely about who holds your PII, your person, it's about the experience you have as a result of people having your data, which can lead to a less than perfect experience for you. So if you think about the physical world, you walk down the street and the shops that you see are the same shops that are there for everybody, and you can choose whether you go into them or not. But thinking about a world where your data is entirely controlled by extractionary platforms who can use it in any way they want. The technology is evolving that if you turn up in the metaverse, you might see different shops have different buying experiences from other people who are in the same place. So you're getting a potentially skewed version of reality compared with other people. And I know this sounds quite abstract when we're used to interacting in the real world or via a static Web 2 platform like Amazon. But that really is the experience that we're walking into if we just walk into a version of the metaverse that's created and controlled by monolithic companies who maybe don't have our best interests at heart.
Gilbert, is it all right?
Please do.
I was going to almost go back one step further in kind of more abstract sense, which is to say, It depends on your conception of what you mean by privacy, and you might go, "Oh, God, shit." But what I mean is this: there is this broach between, or this chasm between, a common law conception of privacy and a more continental conception. So the continental conception is the one that we're probably most familiar with. It's just like privacy is a kind of fundamental right, right? And it's in statute, et cetera, et cetera. A common law conception doesn't come, it's much older, that common law conception of privacy. And it isn't derived from statute. It's derived from a notion of property, right? So you have, I think there's a famous case sort of from the 18th century, Benthik, right? Which is basically the king tries to seize Benthik, who's a publisher, his papers. And he said, no, look, these are mine. You can't take them. You can't take the information from them. They belong to me. And we're all familiar with the kind of, get off my land, it's my land. And it's a sort of enforcement of privacy in that sense as well, right? But privacy as property, or enforced through property rights and control, right? Which is not the same as I have a fundamental right to privacy, which belongs to a sort of a conception of human rights. Now, if we're talking about that conception of control through property and privacy through that, then I think the metaverse affords us our best opportunity in a long while to enforce that conception of privacy, right? Why? Because it affords you property rights in the digital sphere in a much more convenient and obviously enforceable way than you do have now, right? So I can literally own those digital objects. I can own and have and store my own data in my own way, which is what we're working on in Pool in that sense. And I can then also transact in a way that I can also control, because it's far more peer-to-peer than ever before. I don't need some intermediary who then inevitably also hoovers up that data or the metadata on top of it, right? If you're talking about a fundamental, more fundamental kind of human rights conception of privacy, i.e., look, I have a right as a human being not to be monitored, then that becomes different. And then I don't know how that goes. And I think that is probably, yes, more weakened. But that's all the same argument that says we shouldn't have CCTV in the streets, which in Britain, we've totally lost that argument. There are cameras everywhere in a way that I think would horrify Americans or even French people who live on either side of us.
Yeah. So if I'm seeing it, I think if I'm seeing it right, and I think Rhian, it's not so much of a stretch to think about, a virtual reality situation, talking about the billboards. I mean, in terms of that's already happening with our data. I mean, there's a well-known, anecdotes of people's fathers discovering that they're pregnant before they knew, and centralized data. This idea of organizations having more information about your current state than you do, and I think that the metaverse brings another sort of degree of intimate context to that. And I think the example you're talking about, Amazon, where it's kind of been a rush to the bottom, and there's the opportunity to almost like dox potential suppliers to see what have all the interactions of those been like, rather than just their ability to deliver or their lowest price, is very exciting. So I mean, I think the metaverse does give you that potential to have more data about yourself and how you interact with the digital world than ever before, but only if you have visibility and control over that. And without that, the idea of feeling powerless in this sort of wonderland is actually very scary, and which is what I think puts off quite a lot of people from the Web 2 space. Having said that, the sort of a second question I wanted to focus on was, thinking about the first wave of Web3 pioneers, and things like privacy coins that you've written about, Rhian. A lot of that's been around sort of the notion of secrecy as a bulwark against all that kind of observation that we've been talking about, which is essentially ramped up in the metaverse. Whereas that's, do you see that as conflicting with what regulators are trying to do in terms of giving people more access, and regulators needing to have access to police privacy and data. And how can we balance it? I mean, it's interesting. I've got a small kind of crypto portfolio which is currently really hurting, and I look at it using like a market app, the market data app, and that rewards you for engagement, and it gives you offers for stuff. And I was really struck by almost all of them were for VPNs and other kind of cloaks of secrecy. And meanwhile, in today's FT, there's yet another piece on how crypto, secrecy makes it a haven for money laundering and things like, Zug is a magnet for people who wouldn't otherwise be accepted in the conventional finance sphere. So how do we get those two poles closer together?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think crucial to this is this distinction between secrecy and privacy, because in terms of regulatory authorities, maybe the regulators don't need to know everything about your transactions. They might just need to know that they haven't broken any laws, or that they're tax compliant or whatever. So these tools that people are creating that can give you things like regulatory and tax compliant reporting are hugely important in this context. And the same really with, I know we'll probably have time to talk about identity specifically later on, but obviously you don't want people kind of running around in the metaverse in a sort of pseudo real life situation, pretending to be other people, doing things which other people within the community don't want them to do in the context of the game. So that's where things like zero knowledge proofs, which is an entire concept in itself, come in. Because with things like self-sovereign identity, so you have companies like, say, Crucible Network, who are setting up portable self-sovereign identity specifically for gaming environments and metaverse platforms. Their position is, which is a really interesting one, say a game or a metaverse requires somebody to be over 18 before they enter it. Mm-hmm. The actual thing that they need to know is that you're over 18, not who you are, what you bought yesterday or whatever. Do you really need to expose the entirety of data which some company holds on you just to enter this space, when the only requirement is that you're over 18? Or that you're not impersonating somebody else. There are plenty of ways of looking at identity within this context. And similarly with the financial aspects of it, say, I know that regulators, obviously, they look at things like crypto and NFTs as being instruments of financial laundering, whereas you and Shiv and I, people in this room, know that the immutable nature of blockchains actually makes them quite a bad choice for laundering large sums over the much longer term with the analytics that go on. So I just think we need to make this distinction between secrecy and privacy, and to focus on the fact that there are plenty of people creating tools that enable individuals and organizations to be tax compliant and money laundering compliant and other laws compliant, without handing over huge swathes of data which you would prefer to keep private rather than secret. And just one final example, because I've been thinking a lot about central bank digital currencies, and I wrote a piece about this last week because it's at top of everyone's minds at the moment. An example that an anonymous gentleman in Sweden who was interviewed recently about the Swedish digital currency program expressed the feeling that in Sweden, of course, you have this situation where shops that sell alcohol are run by the state. And he preferred to use cash every time he went in because he didn't want the state to know how much wine he was buying. And obviously, people have fears that maybe this will impact on their health insurance, or maybe they just don't want the government to know that they had wine tonight. And that's a perfectly legal activity. So I think it's quite a good example of this thing that it's not a secret. He was quite happy to walk into the shop, talk to the person behind the counter and hand over money, but he wanted to keep that private. So I think we should think about that.
I think, please.
I was going to say, it's a sort of almost a weird irony that a lot of Ethereum developers, anyway, got inspired to go into blockchain because of the NSA revelations and Snowden, because they were that was for lots of people it was the straw that broke the camel's back, and it was the revelation, obviously, that there was this huge state spying infrastructure which spanned numerous countries, and yet. Gilbert, if you give me your Ethereum address, I'll be able to, in an instant, literally within a few seconds, be able to figure out all your transactions and how much money you've got in that wallet, right? Now, if you give me your bank number, I couldn't do that at all. I know all the people you interacted with, and anyone else who had that same hexadecimal string would be able to do exactly the same. The tools are all there, right? It's deeply unprivate in that sense. Certainly unsecret, and it's a terrible choice, as Rhian has already said, for laundering money. There are special ways in which to do this, in a sense, using Zcash, but it's a horrible design. So it's pseudonymous at best, but it's in no way allows people to, and people are lazy, right? So the design choice is usually you have a couple of addresses, and you can't manage, a different address every time you decide to make another transaction. So it's all there to be known. It's often easy then to, in the end, link it back to an individual. I
think some excellent points. Particularly, what Rhian was saying about having this Web3 gives us an opportunity to have a proportionate approach to data, and actually also a way for more scrutiny of current holders of data. A need-to-know approach to data. One of the most immediate, one of the challenges that existing regulators have had with companies is that companies are marking their own homework in terms of how they deal with data rights, and the only means of visibility for regulators has been the volume of complaints, and most people don't complain about stuff that happens to their data. They're either not aware or they've got better things to do with their time. And I think Web3 and the push around, as Rhian was saying, around central bank digital currencies, I'm actually concerned about. I share that concern that that with the role of government, and having CBDCs, that we're essentially moving from corporate to more state surveillance. That the government would have a very broad picture view of your economic activity, from the cradle to the grave. And I think in that context, we already mentioned it, having control of your identity so that you can make proportionate choices. So if I want to rent, say I want to buy some land in the metaverse, or I want to rent an apartment in the real world, I don't have to give all of my my data. I have to give the data which shows that I have my last 3 wage slips or whatever, that I can manage that. So that's a crucial tool. The other element that's I think is going to be more important than ever is our data wallets in Web3. And now, again, like so much of this stuff, it's been knocking around for the longest time. It would be good to know what you think will be the ongoing role for data wallets, and how that be managed in the context of Web3 and Metaverse.
I'm going to ask Shiv to go first on this one, because
I can go first. So you're right. It's kind of been a fever dream of many technologists to say, look, imagine you can just put all our data in a storage vault, a personal data vault is often a term used for this stuff, and then that's what we carry around with us, right? And every time we have a kind of digital interaction, we can put more in there. And wouldn't that be good? For a number of reasons. One, we have access to that store very easily, and so we can understand more about ourselves. Other people could understand lots about us, but on our own terms. A third reason is that once you've ring-fenced that information, it's sort of like little kind of enclosures thing in Scotland, right? You sort of take land that's common, you sort of put a fence around it, and suddenly you can claim ownership of it in a sense. So people who are very interested in data ownership have said, well, you've got to put a fence around it. And once you put a fence around it, then you can start to claim ownership from a legal perspective, right? And ownership therefore brings you control, and control brings you privacy, et cetera, right? So those are the kind of, historical reasons for doing that. The problem has been very practical. It's not hard to build data containers, right? We all carry one around with us with a phone, and we can store, X many megabytes, gigabytes of data. That's not the issue. The issue has been, how do people, put data into this thing? Because if we're all going to do it in a kind of peripatetic way and just put in random bits and it's not structured, then it's actually not useful for anyone else, right? They come along and they go, oh, this is a mess, right? I don't understand. Like, the algorithms won't be able to read this in a programmatic fashion. So that's why they always fail. All these ideas always fail. Now, why Pool is quite interesting, and what the whole data union movement does is to, on a collective level, structure data for a whole bunch of individuals, right? So talking about hundreds of thousands, and there are data unions with hundreds of thousands, even millions of people involved in them. So now you've got well-governed, well-structured data, and they can all sort of start to, the idea being that now you've got that stream of information being generated, you could just copy and paste that back into a data vault, right? So if you join more than one of these things, now you've got a sort of a very quite unique footprint of you. You're effectively re-identifying yourself by copying that back and keeping it. But then now you can put that container you can start to utilize interesting tools like zero knowledge proofs. So now you're not giving away everything every time someone wants to read it. So someone wants to know, how much does this person earn? You don't have to give away all the bank's financial information that's contained in that data vault. You can just return the answer, right? Which is usually what you do on a form anyway when you go into a bank and you want a mortgage, right?
Yeah, and that is a really fundamental shift. And I think there's a question from Christian, in terms of how to enforce privacy. And I think this all raises a question of, are we talking about, and Shiv, you've been talking about ownership, data and ownership vis-a-vis, the GDPR approach to privacy and data, which has been around rights. So do you think we'll get, where should this fall? Should be these be negotiated around questions of IP or questions of fundamental rights? Because that also requires a big retooling of the kind of privacy tech industry and some of the current thinking.
I'll keep this answer short, but I'm sure Rhian will have lots to say on this as well. But I think the conception as well, the modeling of society by many in the privacy community, and this is sort of a criticism but also generalization in that respect, is flawed. It's seen as many multiple individuals versus another entity, usually the state, right? That's not how we live our lives, right? And also people do want to share information about themselves, and they want positive ways in which to be able to that enable them to be able to do that. So it's not just about saying, no, you can't find out about me. It's like, how do I allow you to know stuff about me in a way that I still control, right? And that's why data unions and these kind of, Glenn Weil wrote a wonderful paper with Jaron Lanier about MIDs, right? Mediators of individual data. But the background to that paper was there are all these organizations who kind of do this intermediation for us for all sorts of things. And if you ignore their role in society, you're ignoring actually the bulk of things that happen in our lives, right? It's not, I don't interact with the state like every day. It's really quite rare, actually. I usually interact with Tesco's or my, accountant, right? Who belongs to a firm, right? And I should interact with my accountant more to file certain taxes at this time of year, but there we go.
Ticking.
Yeah, I know. Whoops. But you got to take those things into account, and that's why a data union, in a sense, becomes an agent for not just helping you to control your data and then monetize it, but also enforcing rights. Right? I want someone doing this for me. I'm never going to do it myself. Right?
Yeah.
So I want to carry that person and that organization into the metaverse, in a sense, right? And be able to fight for me. Anyway, sorry.
That idea of delegating, delegating that responsibility to someone that you trust or with whom you've got that relationship is really fundamental. And we talked about data unions. I think the other thing which is worth exploring is, the concept of DAOs, because what's so exciting about that is that DAOs plus smart contracts means that you can take those communities, they can agree principles, what will and won't happen with my data, and that can start to flow through into code, which is really exciting. Rhian, it would be great to know your thoughts on how close we are to that being a mass product in the metaverse.
Right, so it's baby steps at the moment, but it's very topical because at Boson we actually launched our DAO yesterday. So we've been thinking a lot about. Thank you. We've been thinking a lot about community and who is empowered to do what, and this. This whole concept of decentralization and who gets to say what and how to empower and enthuse people. But at the end of the day, it's got to be easy for people. It's got to be intuitive. And I think we've had this conversation before, Shiv, and it's a thing with Web3 in general. The UX has to require, the reason that Web2 companies have thrived is because they have offered a user experience which is easy, where people don't have to think. And unfortunately, I completely take your point. We're not interacting with the state on a daily basis. Our actions are more likely to be intermediated by companies or other organizations. So at the moment, we are very reliant on these very large companies to we sort of feel like privacy is very much in their gift. Sort of Google had the don't be evil thing, but we have the opportunity now with the tools and technologies that we're using to build out these new platforms, which people are collectively calling the metaverse, of not so much don't be evil, where things like privacy and good behavior are not anymore in the gift of the company that you're interacting with, but are actually written into the codes and the protocols themselves. And the advocates for an open metaverse, where Web3 ownership models are baked in, where data wallets can be interoperable with the platforms and so on. It's one of the most interesting debates going on. We were actually founder members of the Open Meta DAO, the Open Metaverse DAO, along with various other organizations, and they use the Buckminster Fuller quote, and I never get it word perfect, about being the architects of our future, not the victims of our future. And I think now more than ever, and even some of the big corporations are realizing it as well. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg may or may not have meant it when he talked about wanting to collaborate and so on. But more interestingly, Tim Sweeney at Epic Games has been really vocal about the need for an open metaverse, because they see that this kind of collaborative future built on decentralized ownership models and so on are really important if we're not just going to keep sliding and sliding into a future where people in the places where we interact with each other know things about us that we haven't necessarily given them permission to know, which leads to suboptimal experiences for us.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and congrats on launching the DAO. And actually, I mean, one of my concerns is that you are going to need, a different ethos to building tech to which I grew up with, and different teams. Pool launched their own incubator program for data unions, for sort of nascent data unions, following the kind of like venture capitalist accelerator model. And I think what's key element of that to me as a privacy advocate is that a large proportion of that is around governance and ethics, is getting this stuff set right. at the start before so you're not taking a bunch of code and principles and just putting a VR headset on, but you're actually taking a very different, a decentralized approach to this. So I'm mindful of the time. We have 1 minute left, so each of you have got 30 seconds to give us a takeaway. What's the killer app? I'll start with Shiv. What's a killer app in Web3?
I'm always terrible at these things, and I should have prepared. I think for me, it would be that thing that I talked about, which is that something that is we're working on it. It's called Pocket, but it would basically allow you to have self-sovereign identity and payments wrapped into one. Bit of a fever dream, but people are doing
MetaMask 2.0. And Rhian, what's the killer tech or DAO that we need?
Oh, killer tech or DAO. It's actually hard to get past peer-to-peer payments and peer-to-peer transactions. And they are still peer-to-peer payments and transactions, whether you have them in real life or the metaverse. I think that's super important.
Brilliant. Thanks so much to Rhian and Shiv, and to all of you. Sorry I couldn't answer all of the questions, but thanks so much for your attention. And we will see you in the breakout areas.